Good. I hope you're all suitably refreshed and ready to go again. Our final presentation before the panel session will start to combine elements of theory and how it can be applied in real life. It's my great pleasure to introduce now Robert de Boer. Robert is currently the director of the Amsterdam campus for Northumbria University, combining this with safety research and a role as director of the Human Safety Academy. Robert has supported the improvement of safety at many organisations across the globe, including Luton Airport, Lufthansa Technik, Thai Airways International, KLM, EASA, and TUI Aviation. Without further ado, over to you, Robert.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's great to be in such a impressive lineup this afternoon. I'm just sharing my screen. Yes, you should be able to see that. I'd like to thank BALPA, of course, for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to Hanneke and others who are new to the safety events. I hope you find them both entertaining and educational. The stuff that I'm going to present this afternoon is not so much a reflection of my own thinking, but much more about the application of thinking of others like Eric and Stephen before me, Sidney Dekker, and many more. And what I try to convey is how we transfer their thinking into practice in aviation and in other domains. And the thoughts I'm presenting to you this afternoon are collected in a book that is soon to appear at CRC Press later this month, and I'll have the details for you at the end. And of course, I'm looking forward to answering your questions in the panel after this session to help improve safety across the globe. What I'd like to present to you this afternoon are these topics: alignment between paper and practice, effective workplace innovations, staying safe, what to do when things go wrong, not coincidentally right at the end of my presentation, and then the role of the leader. And I'll finish with a summary. But first, perhaps it's important to take note of the BALPA position on safety. This gives us the luxury of being outside the system and free to explore new ideas. But this is far outweighed by our lack of control over that system, which means we have to rely on influence and persuasion. And so keeping in mind the position of pilots and others who are not generally at the top of the organization and able to govern what happens, I'd like to revisit that at the end of this presentation to just see what the influence is that we can have as mere cogs in the system. Okay, I'm going to start off with alignment between paper and practice. And as you undoubtedly would think, there are reasons that we have rules. In fact, they've been defined by Hale and Bory in 2013. 5 reasons to have rules is that they act as a memory aid. They facilitate collaboration between different actors. They are a help in training and education. They're used for design and planning purposes within an organization, and sometimes they are used as a means to identify variances in behavior that lead to unacceptable risks and that therefore need to be addressed. So rules are important to keep us safe and to keep others around us safe. And so we should abide by them all the time, shouldn't we? Well, here's an example of a road worker crossing the freeway in the Netherlands amidst oncoming traffic, traveling at about 80 kilometers an hour, running across quickly. And you wouldn't be surprised, of course, to learn that that there are rules against this. This is a bit like the equivalent of a runway incursion in aviation. It's explicitly prohibited in the highway code, yet he has chosen to do that. And then, of course, the organization, the road authority, had 2 ways of addressing this. They could discipline him, not ask him, but suspend him or even terminate him. Or they could try and identify what the reasons were why this was happening, why this explicit gap between practice and procedures was occurring. And it turned out that they chose the latter route, and it turned out that this road worker was running across the freeway to take the markings off a speed sign, which you can just see on the right-hand side of the picture there, the back of it, in any case. That speed sign had been covered during the course of the roadworks and needed to be freed up again so that the original speed limit was visible to oncoming traffic. And usually there is a crash absorber which is ordered to allow people to safely cross the freeway and take away this masking, but that had not turned up. And so, to everyone's surprise, once the road worker was started to talk, it turned out that he'd actually called his boss and said, look, I have to take away the masking of this speed sign. I need to cross the road while traffic is coming. What do you think I should do? And the boss said, no, go ahead and do that. So it wasn't just his individual choice, it was actually together with his boss. And even worse, the road worker told his boss, well, there are 2 road authority representatives here, superintendents, and they're ahead of me, and they are watching me. And those were indeed the guys who took this picture. And the boss said again, well, you'd better do it. And so in the interest of efficiency, of timeliness, this road worker crossed the freeway not once, but twice to take away the masking. And the message, of course, here is that we need to understand, to get the full picture between what seems an obvious breach of the rules, to really understand what's going on and what the thoughts are of the different parties, the different actors that are involved in such an incident, to ensure that we can properly understand and address any underlying issues. And of course, the main underlying issue here was the fact that the planning department had made a mistake and had not been able to provide this crash absorber in time. And this is probably one of the pictures where you could ask yourself whether the outcome of this particular event, to talk in Eric's terms, whether this was done well and the outcome was as we had hoped, or it wasn't. If you look at it in terms of explicit outcomes from a sort of black box viewpoint, then the roadworks were finished in time and the maskings were removed from the speed sign. But if you look more closely and you realize that the road worker had to cross the road twice to achieve this goal, then of course that's less of a success. So apparently there's some situations between a failure and a success that we might want to address when we delve deeper into the gaps between work as done and work as imagined. There are different ways of identifying such gaps, but you do need to get a little bit of a sense for how to find them, where to see them. And what we often do when we visit companies is to ask these sort of questions to people who are at the front end, at the sharp end. When is this task difficult? What are you dependent on to do a good job? Are tools and resources always available to do the job? What do you do if you can't access the tools and resources? What solutions have you come up with that the rest of the organization could learn or help you to improve? Where are we wasting time and money? And is there something which is nonsensical or unnecessary that you have to do here? And in asking these questions, we always get into really great conversations about what people need to do to make sense of the situation that they're in, the rules that they need to abide by, how they actually get their work done. And it's at moments like this that after quite a while, actually, we really get to find out the truth about which corners are not quite as management might expect. This is the way that we identified that there was a 25-page work instruction, which was filled in behind the desk, and other sorts of gaps between paper and practice that really need to be addressed. The next question, of course, is what can we then do to address a gap between work as done and work as imagined, or paper and practice? And for that, I'd like to present this flow diagram to you, which I've adapted from Hale and Boris. And it starts off with having existing processes and rules and monitoring their use, and to let people give feedback about how those rules are being used in practice. That allows us to evaluate the rule effectiveness and the exceptions that occur. And that should be a trigger to scrap or redesign rules when these exceptions become so prominent that we can't really accept them. The scrapping or redesign of rules also allows us to consider alternatives to rules, to define the processes and associated rules, to test these rules, and that's an important step that we often neglect. New rules always require always have their own disadvantages as well, and we need to test them. And if we agree that these are the right ones to do, then we can approve and archive them. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next chapter as well. To ensure that we properly implement rules, we need to communicate about them and train in the rule use, not just in the use of these rules, but also the exceptions that might appear. And then we execute the rules and deal with exceptions in box 8. You actually see two cycles in this diagram. 1, 2, 7, and 8 is the use of the rules. And 3, 4, 5, and 6 is a design loop in which we can improve upon the rules. And depending on the exceptions and the effectiveness of rules, we may or may not be triggered to do that. If we have a rule base which we generate and properly communicate and implement, then we are able to allow our people, our colleagues, to think about how to maintain them and to ensure that the exemptions that might arise in practice are truly felt as exemptions. They make us uncomfortable. They make everyone uncomfortable, not just the supervisors or the managers, but also the people that are doing the work and using the rules as one of the resources. And then we need to ask ourselves, are these exemptions due to truly exceptional circumstances that do not warrant further action? The out of the ordinary, the special case? Or do they require an update in the procedures that we need to address? Or are they indicative of a poor implementation? And that could include that we haven't communicated changes to the rules, for instance, or haven't trained people to use them properly, or we haven't achieved the buy-in that we should be having with rules that are effective. And so it's important that in addressing changes to rules, that we take the work as done as a starting point and approach any gaps between practice and paper in a non-normative fashion, that we're not judging the rule users in any way, but rather that we show pure, real curiosity about why it is that the rules are not making sense to them. In maintaining the alignment between paper and practice, we can also use some change management tools or soft skills to ensure that the ownership of the rules is much more there where we want to have it. Things like ensuring that people feel that it's unavoidable, that this rule management cycle is maintained, that exemptions are properly reported is important. Making them feel that taking ownership for the rules is attractive. Of course, we need to have a physical infrastructure that minimizes the effort for them to signal exemptions. And it doesn't need to be an infrastructure which is bureaucratic in any way. It could be that the managers are more accessible than they might be at the moment. We repetitively need to reinforce the new ways of working. The whole process of rule improvement, not just the exemptions in the field, but also with those that have suffered the loss of direct responsibility for rules. The safety department, for instance, or the engineering department that used to be the owner of all the rules might feel that they have suffered a loss. And we need to do that at the departmental level and avoid focusing on individuals. And whenever we feel that the exemption policy is not being adhered to properly, we should be curious rather than judgmental and understand again why it makes sense for people to do as they are doing. And to do this in such a way that people know that we care about maintaining the alignment between workers done and workers imagined. And right at the end of talking about maintaining alignment, I also need to talk about audits and inspections. They have a role to play, but not one as we would typically perhaps see audits and inspections in many companies. In many companies, the aim of audit and inspection is to get by with as few findings as possible, as unscathed as possible, with no embarrassment. But actually, audits and inspections are an ideal moment for others to see how we are doing in maintaining alignment between rules and practice, and to ensure that any shortcomings that we might not have seen ourselves are highlighted. And so what I sometimes get, it was indeed not so long ago, a notice from one of the safety directors of one of the companies in which she asked for us to ensure that the work areas, walkways, emergency exits, and server rooms were all cleared from obstructions because the local fire and rescue service was carrying out an inspection of the building that precise day. And such a message, of course, was every effort at safety because it's focused on minimizing findings rather than using the external audit as a secondary measure in the support of real worker rules and confirm successful exception management. There's nothing that can be learned from an audit that takes place in such fabricated circumstances. So we need to do audits and inspections, but only once we are ensured, once we have ensured that the alignment between rules and practice are properly managed. Many companies also take the lowest level of the audits much more as a learning review of asking some of the questions which I showed to you a few slides back, rather than using it as a control mechanism to ensure that the rules are actually being adhered to. Much more to understand where work is difficult, when do exceptions occur, and how can we ensure that work is both successful and safe. Finally, in many of our organizations, and certainly in aviation, we have reasonable social cohesion. People feel part of a larger community. And so we can make use of peer pressure and social dynamics to ensure that the alignment between rules and practice are maintained. We can improve transparency and psychological safety. That's a really important aspect of exception management and rule alignment. And it's actually, sorry for me to see that some aviation organizations are detrimental to psychological safety. That psychological safety there is becoming less and less. So what we need is for management to welcome bad news. Bad news being that there's a gap between work as done and work as imagined, which would be potentially embarrassing. But it's not bad news in the sense that it's better to know about it now than after an incident has occurred. Still, many managers in a traditional environment will not welcome bad news. And when they hear about gaps between work as done and work as imagined, immediately say that the gap needs to be closed and that people need to be disciplined. And that's a pity. It's difficult to include outside operators in an environment of maintaining of alignment. We often see that the subcontracting agreements can confound the collaborative attitude. Less so in aviation, perhaps, but oil and gas, for instance, is very tricky. And so we need to ensure that the contractual forms that are being used also support this alignment between work as done and work as imagined. And we need to use routine work and certainly not an adverse event to identify that someone is not executing his or her tasks satisfactorily. And we then offer support, make a plan, and monitor performance. Okay, so this was a chapter on rules and how we can maintain alignment with work as done with them. And every now and then we will come upon a situation there where we want to intervene, where we want to change the way that we're working, impose a major intervention, and then we need to innovate and test that idea. Because remember, as Stephen said previously, we're working in an environment that is complex. Any socio-technical environment is complex of nature, and that means that much of what we see happening in terms of behavior of that system cannot really be predicted beforehand. So-called emergent behavior appears, and that is something that is a result of the interaction between parts, which are very difficult, if not impossible, to predict beforehand. Take this example. I'm sure many of you have kids, and you might even make use of a daycare center. In Israel at the time, there were 10 daycare centers that were operated under a chain, and they operated from 7:30 in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But as often occurs, I've done it myself, you are working just a little bit late, underestimate the traffic jams, you turn up late to collect your kid. And I remember it vividly. My son was sitting outside the door on the stairs with his teacher next to him. Both had their coats on. Teacher was far from amused. I had to be very explicit in my apologies and say that it wouldn't happen again before she would, well, I won't say before she let me have my kid, but you can imagine, you can picture it before you. Of course, that was me just once or twice, but daily different parents turn up late, 1 or 2 a day, and the teacher has to stay. And it's only maximum for half an hour, so it's nothing really, but still it was a very big inconvenience for the teacher every time again. And so the daycare center thought we will introduce a small penalty for the delay, for any delay that's more than 10 minutes. And they tried this for the half of the daycare centers as an experiment. And so you might want to contemplate what was the net effect. It turned out that the penalty, the small penalty, the small financial penalty actually led to more parents coming late, not less. And in hindsight, we can explain it. The penalty was interpreted as a cost to pay. And rather than the very strong social cues that the teachers gave, by accepting the penalty, we sort of were able to free our conscience. And not only did this introduction have a contradictory effect, as soon as the daycare centers stopped asking for the penalties, the effect was retained. So parents, having gotten used to being allowed to come late and having to pay a small fine, found it now less of a problem to continue coming late and not having to pay at all. So this effect of the penalty actually circumvented the strong social pressures that the teacher had introduced previously. And this goes to show you what effects can be in a socio-technical system in a complex environment, that some of the interventions that we do cannot be predicted beforehand and have unexpected effects. Sidney Dekker and others have made use of this phenomenon by creating what we call micro-experiments. Micro-experiments are not ad hoc improvement initiatives because they are well designed and managed and monitored. And they're not large-scale innovation projects either, because large-scale projects are not supposed to fail. Whereas in micro-experiments, we allow for the intervention to be successful or not, but in both cases, the micro-experiment is a success. If we try a particular intervention and find out that it doesn't work, then that's good news. We know we need to move on and find something else. And in the Woolworth retail chain, they compared 3 sets of shops, those with the original setup, with their safety rules, a second set that were completely free in their safety rules, and a third set that were also free to develop their own safety rules, were coached in the process. And it turned out that that last group turned out to be very effective, both in maintaining safety and in also ensuring that the other KPIs of the retail shop were maintained well. And they actually got a prize for the best safety shops within the Woolworth environment later, after the experiments. And so the micro-experiments, in the micro-experiments, it's key to ensure that an intervention is allowed, in this case, in the case of Woolworth, to create your own safety rules, but then also coach and monitor the process. We tried that same approach in a much more safety critical environment in the oil and gas industry on a gas platform in the North Sea, not this one, to be honest. We went over there and we did a couple of different micro experiments. One of them was to introduce a new way of doing audits. And so we were able to create a much more learning type of audit. And we did that as a micro experiment to show the company what the effects would be if that was implemented. And we gave it a fixed duration so that the management was not worried that we would be doing things which would corrupt their safety system, which we couldn't be turning back. And so we ensured that it was safe to fail, that there was a limited time period in which we were able to do the things that we were going to do, and that we had means to dampen the micro experiment. That means that we were able to stop it if it wasn't going the way that we were expecting it to do. And we included coaching and facilitation for the groups that were doing that. The second micro experiment that we executed in that same environment were to change the work instructions. I mentioned the 25-page work instructions that were actually quite unyieldy within the environment. The intention clearly of the work instructions was to take it with you out onto the platform and tick off the different boxes as you were doing the steps. And we quite quickly came, well, not quickly, but after a while, we found out that that wasn't the way it was being used at all. And the operators were conceding that fact. And then we were able to create new work instructions that were much briefer, much more suited to the expertise and the knowledge level of the operators, and were much better to use in the open air that such an oil rig represents. So those were two micro experiments in oil and gas. We also did it in aviation. We did a couple of micro experiments in an aviation maintenance company over in Asia. We looked at, for instance, as you see here, new ways of ensuring that the workers on top of them, the mechanics on top of the fuselage didn't fall down. Originally in the left-hand picture, it's difficult to see, but you see with the arrow there, a rope which is taut over the fuselage, but it's not connected to the aircraft at all. So that means careful positioning and quite a bit, if someone fell, they would still fall for quite a distance. And these two men on the right-hand picture are now working with suction cups that are stuck to the fuselage, which allows them to operate much more freely, yet fall less far if they fall. And the micro experiment, of course, consisted of trying out different versions of the suction caps from different suppliers and comparing that to the base case, which was the wire across the hangar. So that's some examples of micro experiments to try out larger interventions to ensure that work as done and work as imagined are aligned. I'd like to now move on to staying safe. And this is about the situation, about the circumstances that any company can actively try and achieve safety through some of the things that we just described and that Eric and Stephen, etc., described before me. But now, in the natural circumstances of any organization, even public organizations, there's always this tendency, these pressures to reduce safety. And that's been termed drifting into failure, a term that you might have heard about it. It's been written by Sidney Dekker in a book that's been written about. And there are 5 pressures or factors which ensure that organizations, if nothing else is done, have this tendency to drift into failure until something bad happens and a big adverse event occurs, and then of course everything's jolted back. And they are scarcity and competition, decrementalism, sensitive to initial conditions, unruly technology, and failing protective structures. And I'll run through some of these quickly to just illustrate them. The first is scarcity and competition. Here you see a firing range which the Royal Dutch Army's Commando Corps was using to practice shooting and not that so much, but hostage takers to be able to address them. And you can't see it for sure, but let me tell you that these walls are quite flimsy, wood and cardboard. And because of the necessity of being able to practice with live ammunition before these soldiers were able to be sent on a mission, they actually use live ammunition in these circumstances. And as you can imagine, at some point, one of the instructors was lingering behind the wall, which was being shot at, and he was fatally injured. And it turned out that the scarcity of practice and the necessity, the perceived necessity of sending soldiers on a mission was so high that these unsuitable, inappropriate practice environments were being used just to make sure that they could tick the box and send people off. And this wasn't a unique example in the Dutch military. There was also an example of some grenades being used, which the Americans said were unsuitable for practice or for real life. And they were used by the Dutch military as well in Mali. And one went off, unfortunately, at the wrong time. And again, someone was killed. And this is not just the Dutch military. It turns out that many military organizations, including the English and the Americans, have this attitude of can do, which really implies that the mission shall go ahead and succeed. And if we can abide by the rules in the meantime, then that's great. And if we can't, we will still let the mission take precedence. And so that's a worrying attitude. The second aspect of drifting into failure is sensitive to initial conditions. Here's a large fire in Moerdijk, Netherlands again, during the startup of a process. This occurred. There were only 2 limited injuries to the operators, luckily itself, but the plant itself was destroyed. It turned out that at the design of the process in 1977, the company had determined that the priming substances in the reactor, a liquid and a catalyst, did not chemically react. However, several years later, a more potent variant of the catalyst was chosen, but the assumptions about the process that had been made during the design of the plant were not readdressed. They were no longer valid. So no new risk assessment was taken place, and that then, under unfortunate circumstances, led to this fire in June 2014. So once initial conditions are no longer valid, it is very important to have another look at what the situation is. Unruly technology, undoubtedly familiar for most of the audience, TK1951 in 2009, crashing just short of the runway at Schiphol, Amsterdam Airport. Very unfortunate, and here quite a few causes, of course, were identified, but the fact that the radio altimeter was on the MEL list, but still engaged under fluke circumstances, was a major reason why this accident occurred. There was the Dutch Safety Board has written, of course, about this, but only recently, in the course of last year or the year before, a second document by Sidney Dekker was published by them, which at the time had been made available to them, but they didn't really use much of the input in that document, and Sidney's report gave a much more detailed explanation of why it made sense for the pilots to do what they did at the time than the Dutch Safety Board report did. Both reports are still on the website of the Dutch Safety Board, should you be interested. Then finally, failing protective structures. Here we see the 737 MAX, 737 MAX on the parking lots over in Seattle, the Boeing plant. And of course, there we have, many of us have read about the collaboration between FAA and Boeing before the release of the MCAS system, which has not allowed the FAA to take on its responsibility to ensure that this aircraft was fully tested and safe to fly before it was certified. Most unfortunate example of failing protective structures. So what can we do to counter drift? Well, there's 2 things, and I think I need to relate to what Eric has also said. Resilience is made up of responding, monitoring, learning, and anticipation. I'd like to suggest a discussion on risks encompasses responding and monitoring, And the second slide I'll show in a minute is on expertise, and that relates to Eric's learning and anticipation descriptions. Keeping the discussion on risk alive is very important to maintain safety. This is a negative example. The English people will recognize Dominic Cummings, who last year, during the Corona lockdown, was able to travel, well, not able, well, he was able, but did travel 260 miles up to Durham from London, despite the fact that the lockdown forbade such a trip. And I'm not even that interested in Cummings' own considerations and deliberations, but much more was there nobody within his environment, no public servants, no family members, no politicians, no members of the cabinet, who were able to instill on him that this was a trip that was going to go down badly in the press and publicity in England. And I think that is the key element of discussion on risk. Do we have people around us who are able to challenge our thinking and our actions and to help us stop and think for a moment? And this was clearly not the case here. The Dutch participants might remember Minister Wiebes, who sat somewhat triumphantly in the back of his ministerial car and didn't wear his seatbelt. He was sitting next to a journalist, and in front of him was a TV cameraman. And later that night, it was broadcast on national television, and he really took a spanking from his colleague ministers. And again, I ask, wasn't there anyone, including his driver, around him who was able to prevent him from such an embarrassment? On the positive note, keeping the discussion on risk alive, and John already mentioned that this is going to be one of the topics of a presentation tomorrow. The American Airlines Safety 2 Learning and Improvement Team, and they have been able to increase organizational knowledge about work as it is done on the flight deck, and they're able to translate patterns of opportunities into opportunities for pilots to increase their clarity and ability to communicate their mental models. And in that communication, of course, is this discussion of risk. And they believe that opportunities lie with training, informal and formal discussions at various levels of organization, and exploring process change. So very much keeping the discussion on risk alive. And then specifically, they also, towards the back of this report, do a new suggestion, at least for American Airlines, and that is to hold a debrief after a flight to help crews discuss what they've learned, how to handle the same event in future, and how to implement lessons learned. And I think that's a really good example of discussions on risk alive, keeping discussions on risk alive, particularly because we don't usually from the outside get to see these discussions. It's very difficult unless you're party to the discussions themselves to understand in how far these discussions are being held. One telltale sign can be the stop work rule is that most companies have something like a stop work rule, but do we actually take it seriously? Another example is the toolbox talk that that some organizations do just before they embark upon work. Is that being done seriously with content and really looking at the risks that we might encounter in the task that is just about to be done? Or is it just a tick in the box compliance? Now, most companies that have such a toolbox talk will say that they have the former, the real intensive talk about real risks. But if we ask the front line, I wonder what they get to say. The second way to counter drift and build to create resilience is, of course, to build expertise, and that's a difficult thing again to do. Certainly in the well-organized and constrained aviation space. I like this example a lot. The Mail Online, it's an online newspaper. Had headlines saying that Jetstar pilots forgot to lower the wheels as they came into land, narrowly avoiding a major disaster. In reality, in December 2019, an A320 operated by Jetstar approached Byron Midway Airport in Australia during a day with calm and clear weather. the crew decided to let the co-pilot conduct a visual approach to practice his manual flying skills. As they were executing this, the crew realized that they were descending more rapidly than was prescribed, and so they conducted a go-around. This was a good practice opportunity because crews don't often get the chance to do such a go-around. The aircraft generated a few error messages because the go-around was executed with a little too much thrust, and that distracted the crew from the standard procedures. This also led to them missing the gear down item on the checklist, which, of course, they are usually warned for anyway, except when they've just extended it already close to the ground, and that was the case here. Then the automation catches it much later. It did, as it should, but a bit later in the sequence, which now necessitated a second go-around. In the meantime, a light aircraft had entered the circuit and the crew coordinated with it, but due to the close proximity around the runway, the TCAS, the traffic collision avoidance system, triggered as well. The crew was able to land without further complication, and I guess with some valuable lessons learned. And so this shows an opportunity that is taken to build expertise, but the way that not just the press, but also the airline took it was quite different. The airline in this case seemed to be not amused and required both crew members to attend debriefings. I think this is a different debriefing to the ones the American Airlines meant, with flight operations and management, and they needed specific simulator and line flying training related to the occurrence. So in that sense, there's different ways of being able to build our expertise. We should take these opportunities, but then we need to ensure that the world around us understands properly what we're doing. Good, this is what I wanted to say about resilience and building expertise and keeping the discussion on risk alive to counter drift. I'd like to now pop into what to do when things go wrong, because that does happen every now and then. It's part of any complex system that things will go wrong, and we need to try and avoid that. Of course we do, but when they do go wrong, we need to try and learn from them. By the way, adverse events are not the best place to learn. There's so much emotion, blame, guilt, sometimes legal proceedings and money, which surround an adverse event, that really the best place to learn is away from them. Supporting again what Eric said about safety too, of course. Here we see the track that a Boeing 737 took on February 10th, 2010. Boeing, in the middle of the picture, took the taxiway Bravo to take off in the direction of Warsaw rather than runway 36C. This was due to a variety of confusing cues, and the crew therefore thought they were on the runway rather than on the taxiway. In this case, it's really important to realize that although the press release surrounding this event seemed to indicate that it was pilot error, in actual fact, the report indicated just one crew-related factor, and that was not to use the ground movement chart, even though they were on their home airport. And this is a question of conscientiousness for all the pilots in the audience. Do you use the ground movement chart at your home airport? But besides that point, the Dutch Safety Board identified 7 infrastructural aspects which were related to this fact, including the case that the air traffic control didn't monitor the path of the aircraft until takeoff, light snow, which made it very difficult to see where they were, the signage at the airport, which was suboptimal, and particularly the fact that taxiway Bravo was usually used to go from left to right in this picture towards the south, rather than taxiway Alpha, which was used in this particular case. And of course, if you take taxiway Bravo and need to enter runway 36C, you take the first right. And as you can see in this picture, that's what they did this time as well, except they were on Alpha rather than on Bravo. So that confusion was easy to make. When we have cases like this, we need to maximize learning. And ways to do that is describe human error as a symptom of something wrong in the system, to avoid retrospective biases such as hindsight bias and outcome bias, to avoid counterfactual descriptions, not pass judgment, to include the decisions and actions and events that are geographically or in time removed from the incident, to compare what's happening with routine actions. How does it usually go? What do people usually do? If the air traffic controller doesn't monitor the aircraft all the way to takeoff, does he always, does he more often not do that? Does he perhaps always not do that? Was this an exception for some other reason? And therefore, to avoid simplifying the context surrounding the event and to make sure that we don't use wording that mystifies rather than clarifies. It's been called folk models, for instance, and there's a long list of these words. I won't go into that now for the purpose of brevity. One of the most important things that we should realize when we're investigating an incident is that the aim is to learn, for the organization to learn. And to learn means that we have to judge where improvements are challenging, yet feasible. We want to really go to the edge of what the organization can absorb without going so far in learning terms that the organization says, well, that's just a load of rubbish. We're not going to take this report seriously. And so that means that for any type of organization, for want of a better word, for different maturity levels of the organization, you might need to, as an investigator, you might need to identify different causes and formulate different recommendations. And one of the things to keep in mind in doing that is that the most valuable, but also the most difficult part of an investigation is not the study itself. It is the actual mitigation of risks. That's why we do it. I haven't put mitigation of risks in the title, though, because it is quite possible to learn from an incident and decide that the mitigation of risks is perhaps in this particular case at this moment in time not worth the effort. So it's not necessary that an investigation automatically leads to actions, but what it does need to generate is some form of learning. We know that elimination or physical isolation of hazards are far more effective than warning signs or changes to rules. And that is probably where we should focus recommendations on. Yet administrative improvements, including training, are 4 times more common. We need to realize that some improvements actually complicate operations further down, and that's one of the reasons why we talked about micro experiments. Recommendations should be clear and unambiguous, even when they are read separately from the report, like many people often do. And this is the line management's responsibility to work out how to reduce safety, not the investigators. But it is smart to include a realistic time limit for responding to recommendations. It's higher management's role to then hold people accountable for the implementation or not of certain actions, not the investigators. And therefore, the effective investigators understand that the choices that the team makes are subservient to the learnings that can be achieved. Finally, and I think there was a question about this in the chat previously, we also need to think about how we approach the professionals that are involved in an adverse event, sometimes called second victims. And there's a slowly growing body of literature about restorative just culture, which is allowing us to address those second victims, those professionals that have been involved in adverse events, and ensure that we restore the relationship with them and that we get the full benefit of the learning that they and others have been able to generate across the unfortunate adverse event without them getting off the hook, as many people think. There is a way to do that. And it's documented, for instance, in this document, which we've created together with an NHS trust, Mercy Care over in Liverpool, which is mainly focused on mental health. They do some community health now as well. So a completely different environment to aviation. But that was a trust that was previously suffering from a large number of disciplinary actions and suspensions and have now really taken the lead across the NHS in introducing the restorative just culture. Happy to talk about that more in a later event. Finally, I realize that that I've been talking for 50 minutes or so, so I'm going to just go through the last chapter and then we will be done. The role of a leader. We talked about BALPA's position and the fact that many of you in the audience will not be the safety leader or the safety responsible within an airline or within a different aviation or even non-aviation company. But still, it's good to understand what the role is of the managers so that we can help them understand and apply that role from our own position. One of the most important things that we really want to convey is that safety targets really impede safety. This is an example of these goggles. We had a person who had something in his eye. He wasn't wearing this at the time, we think. He won't own up. But the point is on the rig at night, he came into the nurse's station he thought something in his eye, and the nurse looked, but it was already out of his eye, a speck of dust or steel. They were sanding the rig at the time. And he was adamant that it was to be recorded as a non-incident. And we didn't quite understand it, but it turned out that his company was there were KPIs for the number of injuries that were occurring within one of the subcontractors on that rig. And if this was noted down as a real injury, then the supplier would be shortened in his chances for future work. So you see that such a subcontracting contract is really quite detrimental, and those KPIs are really detrimental to safety and transparency. This is another really sore example. You see the plant managers of the DuPont facility in La Porte, United States, walking to a press conference to talk about a gas release that killed 4 employees. And in the background here, you see the sign saying, please take extra precautions when driving and walking. And so we see such discrepancy between the real risks in some organizations and the facade or the ritual safety KPIs and safety messages that are being conveyed. It's really something we don't want our managers, if at all possible, to do. The second thing that we want to try and avoid our managers to talk about is culture, safety culture. I know that there's a lot of talk about safety culture, but in the end, it's something which is quite intangible and can be, what we're trying to achieve with a safety culture can be conveyed in much more concrete terms. What you see here is an oil leak in the north of the Netherlands. When was it? I've got the date. Oh, there it is, 2018, so 2 years ago, 3 years now, 2.5. And the Dutch regulator for the oil and gas industry investigated this event and noted that a major cause of the incident was due to the safety culture at the tank park. So they used the culture word as well. But what they go on to say, is that management has insufficiently succeeded in creating working conditions in which incidents are prevented, a culture which sufficient critical attention is paid to process deviations. There's too much confidence with management about proper functioning of operational system and procedures, and the company must draw a program to change this. So many of the aspects that they use the term culture for are actually very concrete, practical things like managers need to understand when the rules are not sufficient. Employees need to be able to signal when they can't work with the procedures that are being rolled out over them. There needs to be a better dialogue. People need to be able to stop work when things don't seem right. There needs to be more frequent controls of pumps and sensors across the site, and not just a paper compliancy. Those are things that you can do without using the culture word. And that is something which I would strongly encourage. Okay, I think I want to leave the presentation at this stage. I hope you enjoyed what I told you this afternoon, what I presented, and perhaps it gave some thought or some sight on questions that still need to be answered, in which case I'm very happy to take them once the panel gets started. And of course, if you want to read more about the things I've presented, then this book is available from the end of the month from CRC Press. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the second stage of this afternoon.
Thank you, Robert. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation there. Something that struck me actually was the real importance of understanding deeply why people take the actions they do, how it made perfect sense to them at the time to make a certain decision. By doing that, we can then begin to truly understand and learn from these experiences for the better. So we've now completed the presentations for today. We'll finish with a panel Q&A session. So thank you for those that have submitted your questions so far, highly appreciated. To help facilitate this session, we have grouped similar questions together, and for the benefit of the panel, we'll try and identify where those questions are aimed at specific speakers. In terms of the more generic questions, perhaps the panel, if you wish, can answer each question in the order in which you spoke this afternoon. So James has been collating the questions throughout the afternoon, both sessions, and will now guide you through the Q&A session now. So if the speakers could share your videos, and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Choji. Right, I'm going to endeavour to, as you said, read the questions out, which involves going off the screen slightly. I think the best plan is to interact with the panelists through the chat function, which will allow you to follow up questions and keep the chat going. I'll start with Eric. The question came in: how do we develop the change in approaches to safety from the old view towards the new view of safety, in particular in environments where a breach of safety has led to punitive measures? Did you get that, Eric?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, got you.
Oh, that means I have to think of an answer. Well, what I think is we need to get away from this idea about punitive and thinking of and focusing on what goes wrong. I mean, what I'm trying to say is we should look at what goes well, because if things go well, then there'll be no failures, and it's much easier to interact with people, with operators, whoever will be at the so-called sharp end. If you are curious about how they do things, then you should try to find out why they didn't do things. If you ask them, why didn't you do this, or why did you do it in the wrong way, they'll feel they have to protect themselves. If you come to them and say, I'm really curious about how you manage your work, and how did you manage that situation and that situation, nobody feels that they have to protect themselves. And our experiences from healthcare in Denmark, that as one of my collaborators said, that the problem was not to get people to talk, it was to get them to shut up once they started talking. And I think that's true, and I think that's one way of beginning to change the attitude. I mean, Robert talked about, and I don't want to take the word culture into my mouth, it would be terrible, but still what we are trying to do is somehow to change how people look at things. In some sense, it's a culture, not on the front end, but it's a culture on the blunt end. It's how people think about safety that we need to change. And because that's the only way we can actually get the support for making the changes at the sharp end that we believe are the proper way to go ahead.
Yeah, there's a bit of a follow-up question there in the chat. When considering what goes well, doesn't that turn into an infinite number of factors to be investigated? So how do we narrow the scope when coming from a safety 2 perspective?
No, it's not an infinite number of things to look. I mean, I've had that question for the last 10, 15 years now, I think. I don't have a short and snappy answer to it, but it's basically, if you look at what goes well, look at the things that happen most frequently, because they're in some ways the most important things. They're important because they happen very often, which means that they're likely to happen again, very likely to happen again. And usually things that happen frequently are things that you can make really small adjustments to improve. It's not big and expensive, and it's not difficult to understand. So it's not looking at everything that happens. In another approach is that we have adopted is to say, well, when something goes wrong, that's where you get the reports, and that's where you start the investigation. You should ask yourself the question: has this been done before? And the answer is typically yes. And the next question is, has it gone well before? And the answer is also typically yes. And then you say, well, why did it go well before when it didn't go well now? So instead of looking at why it didn't go well, look at why it did go well.
Okay, thanks very much for that. That's good. Yeah, so I'll move on to one for Stephen. Would you recommend people reading about the basics of complexity theory in itself to put context onto what you have been talking about?
There's so much you can read. I mean, I'm more influenced by traditions of systems thinking, which underlies human factors as a discipline and as a profession. The idea that systems are interconnect. You know, this interconnection within systems, that's the focus of our attention. And the outcomes that emerge from those interactions rather than the parts. And also this idea I mentioned earlier about how things work as wholes, depending where we draw the system boundary ourselves. There's so many different traditions of system thinking and complexity science that in a sense came out of that you could read about. And it's sort of, I think what appeals to people might depend partly on their background. So those who are coming from much more of a hard engineering side will be much more interested probably in systems engineering traditions of reading than, for instance, soft systems methodology, which is, as it suggests, much softer, but that doesn't mean that's where they should go to read. And I think there's something curious about us as human beings, that we like to do more of what we're already good at. We like to read more about what we already know a lot of, which is entirely the wrong way to go about things. We should be reading and learning about things that we don't know much of. And there you get yourself up from a low base to somewhere higher. So in a sense, depending where you're coming from, I mean, one of my own favorite authors and speakers purely on just systems thinking, going back through several decades, is Russell Ackoff. He's a very entertaining speaker. You'll see him on YouTube. Some of his talks. He's no longer alive, so you can see some of his talks. That's an easy way in to understand the basics and some of his writings. Stafford Beer is another example. He was at the time at Manchester Business School, or one of the Manchester institutions, universities. Donella Meadows is a great writer on systems thinking. She has a book called Thinking in Systems, which is quite poetically written, but actually some of the diagrams and methods underneath are very much kind of engineering based. So there's so many out with safety that go before new views on safety and safety 2 and so on, that there's so many traditions to systems thinking that you could look at. Checkland is another example. So you have to do a little bit of research into it to have a look what's going to suit you. But you could start with the systems thinking paper on Skyberry that I mentioned earlier. Why not? It will give you a few leads.
Okay, thanks for that. You also started the development of the work as imagined, work as done. Have you seen good ways to connect workers to the management or vice versa? to close the gap?
I've seen a lot of bad ways, which don't teach you very much except for what not to do. But I like to start with most of these kind of things with small group activities, small group discussions, getting people into small groups and starting off by discussing the current reality in small groups, which might be problems and opportunities. And then as you develop the small groups, bring in management into those small groups with some, let's say, ground rules for discussion and some guidance. And that might be things like neutralizing language. You know, that's not to censor language, but it's encouraging more descriptive language rather than more judgmental language. So descriptive language is simply this happened and that happened. It's describing things and it's more factual. Whereas we also have normative language, which is how things should go according to some rule. And then we have judgmental language, which adds another layer of judgment on top of that. And we try to stick out of that. So in a small group environment, if you can set up some guidance for how to have a good conversation, and also encouraging mutual empathy both sides, because the danger with ideas like work is imagined, work is done is that those at the top have work is imagined, which is wrong, and those at the bottom have work is done, which is, you know, which is like the real deal, when work is done at all levels and work is imagined at all levels. And so encouraging some kind of empathy that none of us really has a very good idea about what the other does. So how about we come together to discuss how things really are? And just to bring in a buzzword that we might want to avoid, but it does require some kind of, let's say, either psychological safety or what I call it just trust. It does require the ability to be able to speak out without fearing punishment. You know, so that practically what I do with things like that is remove tables from the room, sit people in a circle simply with chairs, you know, no more than probably 8 or 12 people, something like that. You know, basically think of any ways that you can to bring people back to their basic humanity, to have a conversation about work and life in this organization, you know, stripping the kind of hierarchies down as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'll move on to John to give you a rest for a minute. There's a question come in just now. How do you maintain a balance between safety and cost efficiency? What are the guidelines used to as the decision-making conflict of interest in that area?
That's a tough question, and I think it so it relates back to one of the things that Stephen was talking about in his presentation, which is that making trades is a competency in its own right. So there's all kinds of issues surrounding how do we actually make those trades, and I suspect there's not a particular formula that works for every type of operation. These things are very highly context dependent. There's different organizations that have different risk postures. What's acceptable isn't acceptable. For me, the issue that I've seen at NASA is really more around is information getting to the decision makers, right? So what are the things that are either enabling or preventing the folks who are making those trade decisions in that trade space to be as informed as possible about the trade that they're making, and not basing it on some information that they could have access to that they don't. Obviously, in space exploration, there's a tremendous number of unknowns, and there's a lot of discussion about how we should treat unknown information. Right? Is it if you don't know, do you take an attitude of well, I'm going to assume it's safe until you can prove to me that it's not, or do you take an attitude of we're going to assume it's not safe until you prove to me that it is? And to some degree, while from a safety perspective, you know, you'd say, well, of course, you know, we want to take the latter approach. but we would also, for high risk endeavors, things we know to be high risk, like space exploration, if we were completely risk averse, it would never happen at all. So so it's very, very tricky to think about how you make those trades. But I think the key point here is ensuring that you've set up your organizational structure such that there are opportunities for people to get information and to move that information to the people who are in those who are making those trade decisions.
Okay, thanks very much for that. There's another one here. So data in these environments is not necessarily the whole story. Obviously, a lot leaks out if you're not maintaining the context of that data. Is there work around how to best make that happen at NASA?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It dropped off in the middle.
Oh, sorry. In the data in these sort of complex environments is not the whole story without the context. Are there good ways to maintain that context but continue to make the data manageable?
I don't know if there are good ways there. Yeah, I mean, that's again that's a real challenge, right? Because all of these data depend very heavily on the context in which they occur. I mean, the same behavior in one context is the thing that causes a problem, and another context is the thing that saves the day, right? And so again, I think part of the issue is making sure that information about the context is made available, right? So that how do you capture that? I think that's a tricky thing to capture, right? And I struggled a bit with that, and it's one of the reasons where in our research right now we're really very much at these kind of early stages of thinking about what are the opportunities for collecting data about safety producing behaviors. But then the next step of, okay, how do we interpret those data? What do you need to capture or not capture from the context in which those behaviors are occurring? That's really very tricky, right? Because you know, even if you take them out of context, you don't necessarily know what to do with it. Again, you can create another sort of misleading sort of situation, right? So sorry, I don't have a good answer to that one. It's a great question and a tricky one.
Okay, thanks for that. I can see Stu Clark from BALPA here has written me an essay to read out to you. I was very interested in John's slide about how safety affects safety policies. Sorry, about how safety thinking affects safety policies. For a long time, especially in the area of drones and autonomy, people in the aviation drone industry have quoted accident stats which purport to show that human error plays a significant part in most aircraft accidents. Those who have commercial interests in developing autonomous aircraft use this quote. I see where you're going. I'll get down to the question towards the end there. How do you, we in BALPA have tried to introduce the concept of pilot saves, the huge number of times the presence of pilots in flight deck, ensure that no accident does occur. How do we raise the profile of this concept with the traveling public and ensure it's
right? Yeah, no. So I know it's a huge issue, right? I mean, I encounter this a lot, and at NASA, of course, we encounter a lot of ideas, both internal ideas that NASA produces, as well as ideas that folks in industry are producing about future aviation systems, and a very common theme is, well, we need to get those humans out of there, right? Because the humans are a source of error and a source of failure, and if we remove them, we remove the error and failure. And I think that the story there is to say, I mean, yes, people do make errors, right? That's true, but people also create safety through their actions, right? So you think about how much more often people are doing that. So if the idea is that you can replace an operator with some sort of autonomous system. You can replace a human operator with some sort of autonomous system. The assumption is that autonomous system is going to do all of the things that the human was doing, only better. But we don't even fully understand yet all the things that the human's doing. So if we don't understand that, how are you going to develop an autonomous system to do that, right? And if the idea is that by replacing the human, you've eliminated all the error. By replacing the human, you've also eliminated all of those successes that the humans are causing. So think about just kind of the mental exercise of taking yourself out of whatever it is you do, putting in some sort of automation that does it. How long do you think that system would work until some very simple thing caused that automation to fail, right? Now the argument is that, oh well, but the automation of the future is going to be, able to learn, able to teach itself. And the question then is one that Eric has often raised, which is, how do you ensure it learns the right lessons, right? So we've had some wonderful examples of this in the AI world of chatbots that are left to learn on their own, and within a day start spewing tremendous amounts of hate speech and all kinds of other things. Now, it's a wonderful demonstration of learning, but it didn't learn in ways that were productive or were helpful or made for a well-functioning system. So, part of the argument I tried to make is that and part of it is a statistical argument, right? That if you only look at errors and failures, and you say we need to get rid of the human because they make these errors and failures, you're making a bias error, some sort of a sampling bias error here, by extrapolating that that's indicative of human performance, when in fact it's a very, very small sample that's not representative at all of human performance. So I think really that's kind of the case to make. I think it's a relatively straightforward story, but we also need to consider that there are often other motivations and reasons why companies might be proposing getting rid of human operators that are more related to costs. And certainly for small vehicles, the fact that a pilot in a small vehicle would be taking up a revenue seat. So again, it's a financial incentive to get rid of the human. Like they're trying to close a business case, and they're using a safety argument, but it's a faulty one. Okay,
thanks for that. I'll move on to Robert for a minute. It's a bit of a generic start, but it'll set up the next questions. So the thinking you're going through, is this best coming from the top down, so the C-suite, as they say, or do you think it can be pushed from the bottom up?
There needs to be some direction from the top, absolutely. Some of the things that I suggested were quite contrary to how traditional companies might perceive safety, and that needs at least some support from the top. And in the companies where we've progressed the most, we see that is the case. But then immediately, of course, we need to bottom-up involvement to identify gaps, to identify where sacrifices are being made in the interest of time or scarcity rather than safety, and to not ensure, but to create an atmosphere in which that bad news that we talked about is being created and is being heard. And that's a two-way thing, of course, because I've met and talked to a lot of managers who say, "Oh yeah, no, I'm willing to hear any bad news that they can create for me, well, not create, but that they can bring to me." But in actual fact, that's not the perception often on the floor, on the work floor. There's a lot more inhibition about talking about these things. And what we first see there's of course a progression in that. But what we see often first is that people talk in the third person. They explain about things which are not quite a gap between workers done and workers imagined, not in their own turf, but the people there are doing this, that, and the other. And then that brings up all sorts of sensitivities about, do you immediately go and look there, or do you wait for it to come out spontaneously? It's a lot of back and forth in that. So it's both, really. But it does also need management buy-in. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on what works to explain this stuff to the C-suite? That was one of the questions.
Well, to be honest, I don't know whether I succeeded, but the book that I wrote was primarily targeted at them. Right. And so if we, even if some of the pilots or the safety professionals that are on this call would venture the opportunity to flick through it themselves and then pass it on or leave it lying on their desk, who knows, that might start the conversation. I've done a lot of classes on safety and safety improvement, and we always tend to get the same type of audience, the pilots, as well as some doctors who are involved in patient safety, and a lot of safety professionals, but not always the people that really get to create the circumstances in which this sort of new view of safety can foster, can really grow. We've done that. We've tried to do it once or twice, but it's been very, very difficult for a group of executives to talk openly in just a weekend about this sort of thing. But we'll continue to do so, and maybe just feeding them small bits and pieces every now and then is going to help them to absorb this as well. But by coincidence, today I heard KLM City Hopper, which is a subsidiary of KLM, has a really progressive safety way of approaching safety with proactive safety investigations and that sort of thing. And their chief safety pilot has now been promoted to the whole KLM organization. So it shows you that in the course of a few years, things like that are possible. And I'm hoping for Ben successful for the whole airline rather than just for the City Hopper branch.
Great, thanks. I'll just add slightly to that. You talked about a rule rethink around how you look at rules. Is there in there a recognition that people should, coming from what Stephen said as well, the recognition of the environment they're operating in isn't quite the same as they thought, so complexity is takes away certainty, and there's a different approach needed.
Yeah, well, they think it's interesting to consider who they is. In many organizations, the rules and procedures are created by people outside of the front line with only a superficial input from them. And yes, of course, the circumstances surrounding real work are much more dynamic and variable and dangerous often than we contemplate when we create rules. Interesting example in this context is the work procedures change I did in the oil and gas. So we got some frontline people together with the engineers who generally made the rules into a room. And we said, look, the purpose of today is to create a new procedure, which is much more suitable for its task. And we'd reserved a whole day, and it took us about 3 hours to actually get the front line to engage. Because to be honest, it's much easier for the front line to let the engineers make some rules and procedures and then know that you won't abide by them anyway, and you do your own thing. And so changing this responsibility to the front line is not trivial. It's not like it'll be embraced immediately. It's something which in itself is already a change, and it needs some of the things that Stephen and Eric before him talked about.
Thanks very much for that. Right, sorry, moving on here. It's more of a general question now, so anyone can have a go. Is there a value in an organization having a prescribed definition of safety? So rather than safety is the absence or safety is the presence capacity kind of thing, would you stick to one of those, or would you try and keep it loose?
Well, don't ask me. I'm the practitioner. I'm not the theorist. So let someone else have a go.
James, I think, well, practically, I'm not sure that many organizations define safety themselves. They probably take definitions from elsewhere. I think more what is of relevance to specific organizations is the language that's used around safety. And that's, I mean, from a definitional point of view, as Eric said, you can use both because there's truth in both definitions. So that's fine, we can move on from that. But when it comes to language that's embedded in organizations, that's where we can take action. And certainly within Eurocontrol, several years ago, I thought of just a simple idea of removing all of the adjectives from our taxonomies that we use for safety analysis. Now, if you look in any particular safety report and look in the glossary, that will give you a little bit of insight about the kind of way that an organization thinks about safety. And the glossary will traditionally include words like risk, hazard, error, non-compliance, mistake, non-conformance, negligence, whatever, but typically quite negative words. And it's rare to find in a glossary in a safety report any words that are more neutral or positive. So that's where you can start, and that's in many ways quite a simple thing to do. If you have a taxonomy or classification system in your organization, it'll probably include terms like poor supervision, inadequate teamwork, incorrect decisions, and so on. Now, if you remove those modifiers or adjectives, you're left with terms like teamwork, supervision, decisions. Now, what that means is that classification system or taxonomy can be used, still valid with the past data, but you can now use it not just for investigating things going wrong, but also for looking at everyday work. And you can use that same description to have conversations, not just about why a decision was incorrect, but well, what was the decision? Why did the decision make sense at the time? So these are some things that you can do, and also just start to subtly include just some different language. And it's not all about buzzwords, I think, because language organically changes over time in society. Now we're talking about Zoom, and 5 years ago we weren't. We're talking about breakout rooms. 5 years ago we weren't. So language changes, and you can just introduce words like adjustment, you know, it's just rather than violations. You can introduce words like trade-offs. So, you know, you can develop a small vocabulary that starts to take hold. And as mentioned earlier, you know, this idea that, of course, our language affects our thinking. You know, the limits of our language mean the limits of our world, as Ludwig Wittgenstein said, you know. So by using purely negative language, we create a constraint around our thinking about safety, which keeps us in the idea that safety is just nothing going wrong and therefore nothing to learn from. That's something that we can do.
Yeah, that's good. Just to follow up, what is the do you think is there an important definition of the link between risk and safety? Because there's a lot of discussion about risk, but not so much about safety. Do you think there needs to be an understanding of safety, if you see what I mean, if you can talk about risk? Or
I mean, we probably need to, you know, as Eric mentioned earlier, and I certainly find myself in this position, we need to be talking always about about safety in the context of other goals. You know, aviation safety is not the primary concern of aviation at the moment. It simply, you know, it simply isn't. It's an important concern. It's an important goal among many others, and how we balance these different goals is a thing. So risk is certainly always relevant, and so is opportunity. And so again, even just by talking about risk, we're framing things in a negative way rather than looking at, well, what are the possibilities? What are the opportunities that we have? And now, of course, I mean, we're talking about more integrated management systems of safety, quality, and so on. So we shouldn't take any particular goal singularly, because they always act in collaboration or competition somehow.
Thanks very much for that. So how do we, is there a way either any one of you guys have seen to avoid the phenomenon of dominant logic in the in an industry? Because obviously, in the airline industry, they're, in my opinion, they talk a lot amongst the airline industry, and there's a dominant logic that runs through it. Is there a way to break that cycle, do you think, and other than using events like this, for instance, and people joining?
What do you mean by dominant logic, James? I'm not quite sure.
The way safety is done is aviation, and there doesn't seem to be a shift. Nobody's innovating. There's an overall way you do airline safety.
I think that's too negative. I think in comparison to many other industries, aviation is an example industry still. And we see that as we work in the different domains, particularly in healthcare. Of course, there's a lot of influence from aviation. So I would take that too negatively. That doesn't mean that there's not still improvements to be made. And I would think it would be particularly in the ground services and the maintenance domain more than in the pilot environment. Someone in the chat already said there's an intrinsic interest for pilots to be safe. And that still materializes up to the present day, of course. Plus also the front end of airline operations is usually well educated, well, not usually, is well educated and well organized, including through BALPA, and are therefore able to make to be accepted as an equal sparring partner with management. It's in the other areas where I have more concerns: ground services and the fragmentations there, maintenance, where we still see examples of this gap between work is done and work as imagined that happens continuously and is not signaled up to the moment that an aircraft needs to return to base because something is improperly installed. And the Embraer case that was mentioned in the chat as well is such a prime example. So I wouldn't be too negative about airline operations, but maybe that's a little comfort to many of you.
Well, and a lot of it's going right, that's for sure. Yeah, sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah, driving on from that point slightly, the spreading of these ideas out into companies beyond the safety department, is that, I mean, you talked slightly about that. I guess that's a very important factor because many people have influence over the system and probably need to understand that. I mean, what level would you take that to? Do you feel it's an important factor that the airline should be doing, for instance?
So is that, we're targeting me for that question, James?
Anyone that fancies it.
Say again?
Anyone that wants to. Yep, you could speak.
Yeah. I'll pass for a second to give Eric or John or Stephen there.
Has anyone else got an idea on that?
Just summarize the question again, James, please.
So the safety thinking gets injected into the safety department, and how do you get that out to the outer layers of the company? Because there's a lot of people have influence over the system.
Yeah.
Safety understanding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you need competencies, I think, within a safety department that are not typically recruited for. I mean, if I look at least those that I'm aware of, working with kind of 30 or so countries around Europe in one particular sector, people in safety departments, at least in air traffic management, tend to be from an operational background, from an engineering background, and sometimes from more specialist safety backgrounds. You very rarely have people who are coming from kind of, let's say, liberal arts backgrounds, you know, with good background in communication, in things like graphic design, in things like you know, one of the most useful courses that I ever did in the past was in counselling skills. And before I became a psychologist, I was interested in graphic design, and that's probably why I'm interested now in this kind of outreach. So I would say you have to get people who can do the job of not just analysis of risks and of incident reports, but of actually communicating to the company as a whole and the industry. And that's a different set of skills. You're going to need social media skills, you'll need graphic design skills, you'll need storytelling skills, a whole bunch of different skills that typically the people we recruit, that's not their skill base.
That's interesting. Thanks.
Can I add to that, James? Very quickly. I think one of the things that I would like to stress is that although we have undoubtedly a big group of safety professionals and pilots who are very interested in safety collected here, the responsibility for safety lies not with the safety department. It's an operational responsibility, just like timeliness and productivity is, and it's not something that should be separated out. And that's sometimes difficult for the safety department or the safety professionals themselves to accept that they are in a support role and not in a leading role. And at the same time, of course, it's difficult for the operational manager because there's nothing easier than try and delegate safety back to the safety department, but that's not going to work.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Can I elaborate on that? I think what you said is quite right. I mean, in some sense, I don't think that the question really is very meaningful, because most of the other departments are not, they're interested in things going well in various ways. That's how they make their living. They're not interested in safety. And so should the safety department. It should be interested in things going well and not in safety.
Yeah. That's a good point. Okay. So do you think, having spoken to leaders of companies, that they're aware of the variability in their systems and the amount the employees do to hold those systems together? Do you think this is a point we should stress further?
I think they are, and I think it's if they weren't a year ago, I think they are today, because I think the very, very difficult situation that the pandemic has created has shown the value of flexibility, of finding new ways of doing things, or finding solutions, not particularly in healthcare, of course, but I think also in the aviation industry. I mean, you can't just, I mean, you have to find ways around. Every kind of business has had to find ways to overcome this very, very tricky situations. And if the leaders haven't realized that and seen the importance of that, then, well, woe to them, I would say.
Great, thanks for that. So if you've got, obviously we're aiming this conference somewhat at our union reps. Does any of you have any ideas what they should be going in to their companies and asking for? Obviously they have a dialogue over safety with their airline. From the lower point of view, what should we be pushing up the way rather than, or asking questions about?
Yeah, so I'll kick off. I think this openness about bad news is something that I would start off with. And bad news in my term is not an adverse event, because that is splattered all over the front of the newspapers. That's not the sort of bad news that I mean, but much more where does the work that managers think that is being done, how does that deviate from practice, and why, and then avoid the easy pushback like, well, they should just be abiding by the rules, because that doesn't help us understand the challenges that we're encountering. So that's where I would start.
Thanks for that. Right, there's been a few more questions. If we focus on humans in the system, do you acknowledge the importance of learning processing learning processing being a product of cognitive psychology, which is dynamic, and that the industry is facing a shift in generation X, Y, etc. Should the pillar of safety promotion not be put more emphasis on who, end user, needs to adopt new methodologies and by who for successful implementation? Wow, okay. Any thoughts on that?
I don't think there's a need of new methodologies. I mean, there are lots of ways of lots of knowledge about how to improve learning and how to enhance learning. So I don't think you need to go out and say, oh, we need something new, we need a new tool, a new way of doing it. I think you need to think about what we already know from other science, sociology, social sciences, organizational psychology, and so on. Lots of stuff you can take from there and apply. And from other fields, sports, for instance. I mean, it's interesting in sports, where you have coaches, when they coach the teams, they don't spend a lot of time looking at what they did wrong and say, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. What they do is they look at how things went well, what the other teams did well, and say, how can we do that? They look at the good examples. So I don't think we should look for new and shiny tools. We should simply try to look back at what we already know and talk to other people, because there's lots of knowledge and lots of experience in every single organization. All we need to do is to keep an open eye and an open mind, I should say.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that, James, that to support that with just this idea of starting with what's strong and not what's wrong. And I think that also goes back to the union rep question earlier, that one of the questions that I often start conversations in small groups with is, if you had to explain to a neighbor why this organization is so safe, relatively speaking, and certainly in air traffic management and aviation they are, then what would you say? And quite often that gets a blank look, and the response that comes back is, we've never been asked that before, so we need to think about it. And that's a bit of a problem if you don't know why your organization is doing pretty well when it comes to safety, however defined. And one reason why it's not good that we don't know why things work well is, in an era where there are so many cuts, efficiency cuts and so on, then if you don't know what's giving you success, then how do you know that what you're cutting isn't the thing that's bringing you success? And an example of that would be refresher training, for instance, which, you know, very often starts off with good intentions at 3 days a year or 5 days a year, and then it gets cut to 2 and then 3, and before you know it, your TRM or CRM is 5 PowerPoints in a 30-minute session, you know. And so, but maybe that refresher training, whatever it's about, is something that your pilots, your controllers, your engineers really need. It's a real source of success, and without it, you'd be lost. But it's not recorded because we're always looking at the wrong, starting the conversation with what's wrong rather than what's strong. And so I like to have 4 questions. So first of all, what's going well in your organization? What are you proud of? What would you recommend to others? What do you wish you'd have done earlier? That's the first question, and talk about that. And the second is, what challenges and dilemmas are you left with? You know, what makes your job difficult? What makes the day longer than it needs to be? You know, and then the third is, what do you want to help you resolve your challenges, your dilemmas? What do you want? Is a direct question. And the fourth question I will often ask is, what are you prepared to offer? What are you willing to offer? Either to get your wants met, or out of the pure goodness of your heart, what are you prepared as a frontline professional to offer? Now, the important thing with that conversation is it starts on an asset footing. You're starting with what's strong. If you don't start there, you'll never get to it. You'll complain all day about all of the problems. And quite honestly, very few managers want to hear that. And so it's a matter of sequence, this asset-based approach. It's not like appreciative inquiry, you know, ignoring the bad and talk about the good. So I think that applies also to the union rep stuff. Find out what it is about your organization that makes it strong. And many of those things will be human related, you know, about how we adapt.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I've got one here. How do we bring in the realm of anthro-complexity in managing system safety in the complex aviation environment? I'm not sure I know what anthro-complexity is. Does anyone else?
I do know, but it's not, I don't think it's something we're going to cover in the 15 minutes left in the conversation. It's a term that was developed by Dave Snowden, I think, on about complexity science and comparing, you know, complex systems to more like natural ecologies, which, you know, which has some value rather than comparing organizations to complicated machines. So this is something for people to research themselves about sense making and so on. But in the 14 minutes we've got left, I think we'd all flounder on that one.
Understood. Next one's for John Holbrook. How important is having the right personality type at the top in instilling a just culture where the admission of mistakes and errors is encouraged in a non-punitive environment?
Well, I think it's really important, although one has to think about what does it mean by the top, right? So certainly within an organization like NASA, NASA is an organization within an organization within an organization. It's an organization of organizations. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the person at the top of NASA, right? I mean, you know, obviously, but yeah, I think it's hugely important that the people who are leading the aspect of the organization that a particular group is working within has a huge impact on how those people, whether those people feel valued, which has a huge impact on their own performance, their willingness to speak up, their motivation, and the thing that I see a lot at NASA is, so I say in a lot of ways it's a very healthy organization, and that the people who are in those positions really genuinely want good things to happen, right? They I think see the value in people. They would acknowledge that people add tremendous value to our endeavors. The tricky part is even within organizations like that, you still sometimes see mixed messages, right? Between these are the words we're saying, and this is what our policies are conveying, often unintentionally, right? And often it's a result of things like, you know, we tell you this is important, but we also tell you this other thing is important, and both of those things are true. But then we're asking, you know, without clear guidance, sometimes we're putting that on the front end worker to decide to kind of make that trade decision that you know, without necessarily the full picture. And sometimes someone might decide, oh well, I'm not going to speak up about this because you know, I don't think this is very important, or you know, which is, and what they're doing is actually taking that decision away from the person whose job it may be to make that decision. And so again, it's very tricky to figure out how you just create, and I think the leader has a huge role in that, not just in saying these are the things that are important, but in really looking at how that is implemented in policies in the organization, getting information on that. So when you find out, oh, somebody didn't speak up, okay, well, why didn't they? Not in a punitive sense, but what were their barriers to speaking up? What can we do about that? You know, I've seen some excellent examples of leaders of organizations at NASA running meetings in really good ways, in ways that so that's an example of something that the leader might do, right? The way you run a meeting can have a huge impact on whether people are speaking up, whether people feel like they can, the sharing of ideas, asking, and that's in fact a kind of training that people can. I mean, that's a learnable skill, right? And it's just a matter of are the leaders willing to, are they open to that?
Yeah, thank you. Got a couple more, and I think we'll need to wrap it up. Stephen Shorrock, what are your thoughts on why there is a gap between work as instructed and work as done? I'll read the rest. The analogy of the controller gaining his license and then learning on the job is something many airline pilots can relate to and experience firsthand on the completion of initial line training. Is there work going on at Eurocontrol to increase safety by bridging this gap and making the initial qualification more real life relevant from the outset?
It's like any of these, what I call proxies for work as done, that it'll never be possible to fully simulate work as it actually is, because there's so much, for want of a better word, mess. And the way that we train often starts in classroom or theoretical training and then goes to simulators and so on. And it's simply impossible to simulate all of the mess that you have in a control tower or in a cockpit. And I use mess in terms of lots of interactions happening all at once in unexpected ways that you can't proceduralize and so on. But probably more familiarization with the world that you're going to enter would be a good thing. And for instance, when I started at NATS UK, like 20-something years ago, controllers then would have familiarization flights, for instance. Controllers would also train in all disciplines. So you would not just train in like en route control or tower. You would train in everything. Now that gave a huge advantage in as much as you had a wider base and you saw aspects of the real world, and you would even get your private license very often. Because of gradual cost cutting, all of these things go, and then you reach a tipping point where probably too much has been cut. So again, systems have a history, and perhaps we need to go back to what's being cut that we didn't realize perhaps wasn't a good thing to cut, and more access to the real world of work as done. At least observing it is probably a good thing to bridge that gap between work as instructed and work as done.
Thank you. Another one here. What can organizations do to avoid the Cobra effect when an attempt to improve safety actually achieves the opposite?
Yeah, I think that's why I tried to introduce micro experiments. That's exactly why in a complex environment we need to test things out before we roll out the definite solution. So that's one way of doing that.
Yeah, very much. Okay, I think that's where we're going to have to wrap it up. Hopefully Joji's still here. I think he's going to give some closing remarks.
Brilliant. Thank you, James, and thank you, panel, for answering the questions and engaging so well with our audience. Now, I appreciate there's probably some of you who've asked questions and we've not been able to answer them today. We'll look into ways in which we can maybe try and sort of close that gap and answer the questions and make that available on our website together with presentations from today. Those of you able to attend tomorrow, obviously there'll be further opportunities to engage with our panel tomorrow. So in terms of today, I think I hope you all agree it was a really stimulating and fascinating introduction to this subject. So we've introduced the key theoretical topics. We've begun to illustrate their application, which will be built upon again tomorrow in more depth. So really, all that's left for me to say really is a big thank you to all of our speakers again, both for your presentations and for answering the audience's questions. I hope you found the experience enjoyable as well, and maybe you can join us tomorrow as members of the audience. Thank you also to the audience for your attendance, your interest, all of your comments during the presentations and during the panel session, and also for your questions. So we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. It'll be 1 o'clock again, UK time, for more practical examples and for words of wisdom from our regulators. So thank you, have a good evening, good day and good night.
Bye, thanks.